Chief Technology Officer and a professor in the chemistry department at Colorado State University. She received her PhD in physical chemistry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was a Harvard postdoc fellow under the supervision of Dr. David Waits. In 2010, Dr. Krummel joined the faculty of Colorado State University in the Department of Chemistry. Dr. Krummel focuses her research on probing chemical structure and dynamic in the condensed phase. She has built a research facility at Colorado State University that includes 3 nonlinear optical spectrometers that allow molecules to be studied in bulk solutions at interfaces and underflow conditions. The Krummel Group has also been active in development of fluidic tools that are compatible with the vibrational spectroscopy and allow investigations of molecular systems away from equilibrium. Professor Krummel has been awarded a National Science Foundation Career Award for Early Career Investigators in 2013, and in 2015 she was named as an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow. Without further ado, we'll start.
Good morning. It's good to be with you all today. And Dr. Krummel and I are going to be talking about a study that we did on paraffin in the Midland Basin. So I'm just going to go through this, and then Amber's going to come up, and hopefully we can get some Q&A. So I just finished reading the book, Steve Jobs, a biography. If any of you guys have read a book like that, you ought to get a prize, because it's a marathon of a book. In the book, Walter Isaacson, the author, talks about how at a point in the late 90s, when Steve took back as CEO of Apple, he and the Apple team kind of were looking to reinvent the company. And it was at that time that they brought about an ad campaign where they had billboards with photos of guys that they credited to changing cultural, modern society. And so they had guys like Pablo Picasso, Thomas Edison, Muhammad Ali, and some of these other cultural figures. And on the top of the billboards, there's a tagline that read, "Think different." And so, kind of rolling off that tagline, when we at Diamondback approach issues, we're always considering what the industry standard is, but we're always pushing ourselves to see what is it that's extra that's out there. How can we do a better job at minimizing failures, for instance, in the production department, and lowering the LOE cost. So I first came to work for Diamondback about a year or so ago, and I was presented with the opportunity to work this field that I'm going to be talking about. But within that field, they had already established kind of a framework of dealing with paraffin. We were using kind of just the typical Permian Basin style conventional method of dealing with paraffin, batch treating wells and such. It wasn't working. And so this study, this opportunity was kind of laid into my lap, and they said, get after it. So we were open to any kind of opportunity that would allow us for success, and we were able to find a solution that worked. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So kind of just to help kind of keep the attention, I'm going to attack the bottom line first. We were able to find a solution that mitigates paraffin formation, extends run life between wells, that, reduces failure time, and ultimately reduces operating expenses for Diamondback wells. So kind of diving into paraffin, if you don't have to deal with paraffin in your oil wells, you're blessed. For the rest of us, paraffin has been around since the beginning of the oil industry. So back in the first oil well in the 1800s, they were dealing with this stuff. It's commonly addressed as long chain alkanes due to dehydrated oil. It's often caused by temperature drops, pressure differentials, increased gas production. Common treatment methods in the Permian, everybody uses wax crystal modifiers at some concentration. We heard yesterday some of these companies are using various degrees of xylene and toluene, whether that's treatments, on a frequent basis or in workovers, hot oil applications, hot water, and then, when you get a workover rig there, paraffin knives at times, at severe times. The field that was in focus for Diamondback is called the Bloxham Prospect. It's a field that's about 45 minutes south of Midland. It's considered the South Midland Basin. This field is kind of the worst among paraffin issues for Diamondback's portfolio. This area was kind of initially a part of the multi-stacked vertical play called the Wolfberry about 10 years or so ago. And then as horizontal technology kind of swept through, we started drilling Wolfcamp shale wells and Sprayberry shale wells also. So we've got a mixture of both vertical wells and horizontal wells. At this point in the time of the life cycle, all the wells are in their exponential decline. A lot of the wells were kind of initially drilled in the 2009, 2010 era. And so this is just kind of a map kind of showing where we are. The red dot is the Prospect Field, kind of southeastern Upton County. You've got the, for those of you that don't know, we've got the Midland Basin that's kind of on the north, south, and the eastern side. The Central Basin platform is kind of shaded blue, and then the Delaware is off to the west on the left side. So for this particular field, any well work that we do is always met by dealing with paraffin. The cloud points range from surface. Sometimes we see paraffin on the surface pipe all the way down to about 3,000, give or take. When we have a rig doing work, we are on average 1 to 2 days just focusing on paraffin before we get to the actual failure, whether it's the rod part, hole and tubing, or what have you. Worst case scenarios were 5 to 7 days, hot watering, rod stripping, you name it, trying to take care of the paraffin to clear everything out. Diamondback's common treatment methods included hot watering, pumping solvent, often multiple times, sometimes day in, day out, pulling incrementally over string weights, rod stripping, and then in severe cases, we were pulling the old hacksaw out and cutting those things out of the tube. So I learn best with pictures, and so that's what I have a lot of my presentation today. So here's a common photo that we see stripping out of the tubing there. We've got dehydrated paraffin just kind of falling off the rod string there. These are more beautiful pictures. There's a rod in there, as you can see, with a chunk of paraffin hanging off the tubing. In instances where we can't pull the rods out, we unset the TAC and then come out with the whole thing joint by joint. And so this is an instance of that where we've got the wax kind of holding it up on the inside. Another example of stripping rods out. Beautiful. This is my favorite. Just like the issue that I described before, where we're unsetting the TAC and coming out tubing joint by tubing joint. There's a rod in there somewhere. We've got the pin end of the tubing above, and then we've got the box end of the next joint. This is on the rig floor, and the paraffin's just occupying every void space in that tubing. The interesting thing about all these wells is these are all batch treated wells. So there's wax crystal modifier in there pumping down the backside at some frequency. It's obviously not doing its job. So initiating what would become kind of our version 1.0 test, we set up parameters for this first part of the study. We as a team kind of went out and issued opportunities for 3 other kind of unconventional style companies, along with the existing chemical company we had. We had guys that were offering the nanoparticle blend. We had some guys offering this aromatic, aliphatic type chemical. And so we had 4 companies in total. Just a couple of points about the first test. It was to be a 3-month test period with a well pull at the end, just to kind of verify what we had, physical examination. What was special about this too is that we went to the chemical companies and said, hey, you guys tell us what to pump. You guys tell us the frequency, the methodology for treatment, and we're going to yield to you for the success of your particular well. We also utilize, we had our pumpers checking back pressure valves, check valves, kind of getting a surface analysis of paraffin kind of on the top. And we also utilize flow line recording devices, so checking the trends for flow rate and pressure changes kind of throughout the time frame. And so after the 3-month period, we went to move a rig over there and started pulling rods. We pulled all the wells unannounced, just to kind of keep everybody on the same playing field. Sometimes you got to do that. And so in some instances, in one particular example, we saw paraffin regeneration within 2 weeks of initial circulation. In one of the other examples, the recording device showed that after each subsequent circulation, this one particular company had, one treatment would show an increase in flow rate and a decrease in pressure, and the very next treatment would show the complete opposite. And so that was, a bit confusing. Still, another one of the examples showed completely positive results the whole way through from the recording device, and surface samples, there wasn't a drop of paraffin. Yet when we went to pull the well, there was clumps of paraffin falling off the rods on the pulling unit. Riddle me that. At the end of the day, all the results contained light to moderate hydrated paraffin, and that really wasn't acceptable to what we had already seen with our conventional plan in place. And so here's some photos just kind of showing kind of the results of that particular test, kind of going from left to right. You got one example of hydrated paraffin. That's a rod there, kind of in the derrick or in the slips there. You can distinguish kind of the clumpiness there. In another pool, I've got the tubing there with the sheath of paraffin on the ID of the tubing, and then on the photo to the right, kind of a similar circumstance. So here I was, 3 months in to this test, no real good results. My boss is asking me, "Hey, what do you have?" And I don't really have anything, so I'm thinking to myself, well, do I need to make something up, or where do I go from here? What's interesting about Diamondback is that we have the technical teams kind of rotate through each team, sitting in on meetings just to kind of get a better idea of the bigger picture. So we had a geologist that was sitting in our production ops meetings for a month previous, and he was hearing time and time again about this mysteriously stuff with paraffin hanging up our wells all the time. And he found himself at a conference, he would later tell me, where he ran into the company Revelin, and they were advertising this tool that's supposed to mitigate paraffin formation. And so he told me about the encounter and said, "Look, I'm a geologist, you're an engineer, but I heard about this, and maybe you want to try it out with your issues." And so we connected with those guys and brought them into the office for a conversation. So to kind of describe a little bit, kind of a summary of the tool, Amber's going to go into detail about this, but what they offer is a tubing sub. They have rod variants too, but it's made out of this aluminum alloy, and how it acts is kind of like a pressure transducer. There's several examples here, but you've got pressure coming in out of the wellbore, and that transducer translates that to an electrical signal. Another way to think about it is a tuning fork for your piano. You kind of bop it on your knee, and the force that comes into that fork is translated to a certain pitch, a wavelength, and that's what you tune your piano to. Well, the tool works in a similar fashion to where reservoir fluid is coming into your wellbore, and as it passes through that tool, it gets a boost of amplitude such that the molecular structure is prevented from attaching to each other. And so you don't make the paraffin solids disappear, you just keep them in solution as they flow up through the tubing. And so this is a one-way reaction. It doesn't fall apart, or it doesn't attach to each other as temperature decreases all the way up through the wellbore. And so, this as I realized, this is not to be confused with the magnets, that were offered 10 or 15 years earlier, or You can't play your favorite country radio station off the wellhead on this one. I guess long before my time, there were several iterations of something like this. This is a purely passive tool. So after learning about this and really having nothing to show my boss, I said, yeah, let's try it out. So we rolled in kind of a version 2.0 test. It involved 7 wells. We used 2 of our legacy horizontal wells and 5 vertical wells. The parameters were as follows. We pulled all the wells to install the tubing variant of the tool. We also canceled our chemical treatment for this, kind of in line with the systematic deal, just changing one variable at a time. In order to make sure that this worked, we had to not rely on the treatment that we were utilizing for the well. We also used pre and post test fluid samples to see if we could analyze fluid differences. We had our pumpers, the same as before, checking the back pressure valves and the check valves to look for surface samples. And then after 3 months, we were going to pull the wells. And that's what I'm going to go through here. The Betty Ruth number 3 is the first well that we pulled. This well, on the initial installation, Revelant recommended to us that we install the tool beneath kind of the seat nipple and above the pump intake. Communication got sideways a little bit, and our consultant installed it below the pump intake. So in these vertical wells, we use kind of the poor boy gas separator, Mother Hubbard style. But that didn't seem to matter. 3 months in, you can take a look. I've got the photos of the rods kind of hanging in the derrick there, zoomed in on the bodies. There's slight nodules of paraffin there. It's very non-uniform. And then in the wider parts, kind of in the upset and the collars, there is some presence there, but we had no issues unsetting the pump, no issues coming out of the hole. Going to the next well, the Neil 8, number 7, kind of the same thing. I've got the rods that we're looking at, kind of the upsets on the left side, the bodies kind of in the middle. And I just asked the guys to take photos of anything that you see with solids. And this is the best that they could come up with. Again, we didn't use any rod strippers, no hot watering, none of the conventional methods that we all kind of use before we get on the well. The Janey 16H, this is Diamondback's first operated horizontal well. So there's a bit of sentimental value with this one. Looking at the rods on the right side, nothing's there. I asked the consultant for a photo of the tubing. I got exactly what I asked for. I should have asked him to get a photo of the tubing on the racks, but there you go. That is a tubing in the slips looking down hole. So that's exactly what I asked for. As far as you can see, though, there's no paraffin in that one. The interesting thing about this one, too, is that this well failed actually 2 months into the test. And so, we initially were thinking, well, maybe it's a solids issue. And so as we pulled it out, to our surprise, there's absolutely no solids on those rods. We ended up pulling the tubing on this one, too, and couldn't find a trace of anything. The pump was sand cut. We had some sand in the mud anchor. So going on the Janey 2, kind of as we moved along the 7 wells, as I said before, typically we're a deal where it would involve 1 to 2 days just dealing with paraffin in order to get the rods or the tubing out of the hole. In these instances, we were rigging up on the wells, pulling the rods out, taking a look, running everything back in about 8 hours. And so our workover crews worked about 10, 12-hour days. We were rigging up and then rigging up on the next well on the same day. We were moving pretty quickly. The couplings and the upsets, there's some hydrated oil there, but there's no paraffin to speak of. The Janey number 3, this is just kind of get old after a little while, but no solids to speak of. There's some hydrated oil, but there's just none of the solids that would have existed normally. The Janey 4H, this is a well I had the pleasure of going out on myself. These are photos from my iPhone. And, I got all the rods kind of in the derrick there. And I just tried to zoom in on any solids that I could find. And, it's pretty difficult to there because there aren't any. This is the photo that my boss took the leisure of stealing from me at his slideshow yesterday, and that's okay. He's the boss, I guess. So, the crystal number 1 is kind of the best story that we have. This well, we had actually intended to put the tubing tool on another well. We had 2 rigs in the area at this time. That well wasn't as bad as this well. This well is one of the wells that we were treating paraffin for a week before we could get to. I think we had a pump issue. So this was the well we ran the gamut on. We hot oiled, hot water, pulled a lot over the string weight. We had to replace the fiberglass rod taper. We had fiberglass shrapnel in the tubing. It was a disaster. And so just kind of looking at it, you can tell basically on the photos on the left-hand side, you've got the rods kind of with caked paraffin on either side. The middle photo shows kind of a rod inside tubing with paraffin kind of collecting in and around it. We also had to lay down, because of the hot watering, we had to lay down about 20 joints of tubing that were completely packed off with paraffin. You can see that in both the right up and down photos. And then, when we went to pool the well, kind of 3 months afterwards, this is what the rods looked like. The interesting thing about this well is this well was down and not moving, not producing anything for about a week before the rig moved over there. And that's important because people also tend to think that paraffin happens when there's no fluid movement. When you just have gas kind of coming up through the tubing, drying things out of the tubing. And this well was sitting stagnant for a week, not producing anything, and these are what the rods look like after not moving fluid for a week. We actually put everything back in the ground, put the pump and rods back in the ground, and found that we had a surface electrical drive box issue for this well. So now the important question of what you're all probably thinking is, well, what does this great thing cost? If you really want to know the answer to that, you can ask that gentleman right down there in the front. I'm not going to tell you what we pay for it, but I will tell you our cost trends. And this, so I'm just going to go into it. The blue curve just kind of shows kind of what we pay for the Enercat relative to what we're paying conventionally. You purchase the tool. It's a one-time deal. You purchase it, put it in your wellbore, and walk away from it. The yellow curve illustrates, it's a factor of 3 things. It kind of shows, what we pay kind of on a conventional basis. So, all these wells were batch treated before with some various form of wax crystal modifier. That's factored into there. We also factor in when we're on for a workover, flat time associated basically with rig costs, rental rates, stuff like that, hot watering, trying to, time designated dealing with paraffin before we get to the failure. And then the third factor is equipment replaced due to dealing with paraffin. So like that example before, hacksawing fiberglass rods out, well, we had to replace that taper. So I kind of averaged that over all the well, kind of on a well by well, averaged that over the total wells in the field and then annualized it. And this is what we have. One method versus the other, we pay out in about 1.5 years. At about 3 years, we're 2 times the expenses ahead. And then at year 5, we've saved about a factor of about 3 times what we normally would have spent. And this is just on a well by well basis. I did this because oftentimes chemical companies and service companies will say, well, the benefit is the extra production that you get. We're not looking at it from that standpoint. We're just looking at it based on an expense, one methodology versus another methodology. In our opinion, yeah, you're reducing the restriction kind of in the tubing, but any extra production that's there is gravy on top. I don't think is necessarily quantifiable in this type of scenario. And so our expenses are lower with the Enercat. So in conclusion, I realize this is a 3-month test. Most times when you make a chemical difference, you don't know the benefit of it until you pull the well when it fails. 6 months down the road, 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road. And so we're going to continue to monitor that. But what we do know is looking at the trajectory of both the conventional method where you saw paraffin caked on after 3 months and then the Enercat method where it was free and clear, those 2 trajectories are going in a completely different direction. And so we're going to continue to monitor that. The bottom line for us is that Diamondback is going to use Enercat technology where we have severe paraffin. And what that's going to do for us is it's going to mitigate paraffin, it's going to prolong time between well pools, and it's going to reduce operating expenses. So I'm going to have Amber come up and tell us a little bit more about how the tool works, and we'll go to Q&A after that.
First of all, thank you, Matt, and thanks to Diamondback too for partnering with us and really showing how we can drive this innovative technology in the industry down here. What I'm here to do is really to give you a little bit more in terms of technical details as to what the tool is doing and how it's working. With that, I will also say that I'm not going to dive very deep down into the weeds, and if you have deeper questions, please feel free to come by and talk to me. First of all, what we found is that the Enercat tool is effective when dealing with paraffin, asphaltene, scale, heavy oils, and even more recently, we're dealing with emulsification issues. Okay, what we generally see is that these are production data, production curves prior to installation. Oftentimes what happens is that production will be decreasing. A company will go through a workover, they'll install the Enercat tool and realize that it's doing pretty well, and then sometime later they will turn off chemical. Okay, and what you'll notice is that what we're doing is really stabilizing an average production in nearly all cases that we have. Okay, over here on the right, this is a case study of where it was a severe asphaltene problem. Okay, our goal is really to optimize production in the industry, okay, and do so in a way that reduces the amount of chemical that has to go down. I'll also note that this is a preventative solution as well, okay? So if you're talking about drilling new wells and going in and putting in a completion, right, you may want to consider actually having a tool in there so that you don't have to go through these problems just to fix them. In general, the operating principle is really to stabilize molecular dispersions. Okay, and everything that we do, what we're looking at, whether it's preventing asphaltene flocculation, right, or even reducing emulsions, what we're talking about is really promoting molecular solubility and preventing paraffin crystallization and scale deposition because of that. All right, the way this works is that we use and we make use of material composites. So Matt mentioned the idea of a tuning fork, and what the tuning fork really shows you is how classical waves move through materials. Okay, no matter what the material is, you can do that. And it does so by taking advantage of the lattice dynamics that are associated with that material. Every material has its own lattice dynamics and its own vibrational characteristics, and those are the things that we're going to take advantage of. So in this case, I think about it also as a bandpass filter. So if you're interested, if you think about electronics a lot, right, the tool here, the material that's on it, right, is really acting as this bandpass filter. So if we have a source, and in the subsurface, what we're looking at really is what I would consider a black body source. So you have a continuous range of frequencies available to you. And then what happens is that depending on what those frequencies are, and those are in resonance with the lattice dynamics of the material, they're going to make it through that tool, okay? And the ones that are not in resonance with the lattice dynamics are going to basically be dampened out. Okay, and when we do that, that allows for, let's go back. So that allows for these specific frequencies then really to drive the amplitude of low frequency vibrational motions in molecules. And when we do that, we'll skip over here to this cartoon of a potential energy surface, okay? And what happens is that when we're down in the reservoir and you're bringing up molecules, right, all of you know that it's not until you have a dramatic change in pressure or change in temperature, right, that you actually see things like scale deposition or paraffin deposition, right? And that's because when we're at subsurface temperatures and pressures, all of these molecules are really in an amorphous state. What that means in terms of where it sits in the potential energy surface is that it sits up here in basically a saddle point, ripe for being tipped one direction or another. And what we're interested in doing is tipping into basically a local minima that actually has physical properties, right, and physical characteristics that are more useful. So for instance, in the paraffin situation, what we're doing is we're driving the paraffin colloids basically into a different local minimum such that they no longer have attractive forces anymore, and so they're not depositing out. All right, so we have some instruments in the lab that allow us to actually characterize what's going on with the fluids. So I just wanted to show you some of the work that we've done with the Diamondback fluids, okay, and really think about this from the fluids perspective, or the response to the Enercat tool from the fluids perspective. All right, we do coarse grain measurements that you see a lot, so pour point or gravity measurements, for example. We also have a rheometer, so we do wax appearance temperature, thixotropy measurements, and other viscosity measurements. We take a look at chemical composition using gas chromatography coupled with mass spectrometry, and then we also do water analysis. So we take a look at what's going on for the chemical composition and physical properties of the water. So for example, I'm just going to show you the results from the Diamondback Neil 8 number 7. Okay, so I'm picking one and then I'll show you kind of a summary of results. So in this case, we see actually a bit of a decrease in the pour point, slight increase in the API gravity. Right, this graph right here is a graph of the thixotropy measurements that we do. And what we're looking at is really how the structure build up in that fluid. So this is a rheology experiment, and what happens is that as structure builds, this curve will get steeper, okay? And what you'll see is that in the blue, this is the pre-Enercat sample, in the green, this is the post-Enercat sample. So there's a slight change in how the fluid structures, all right, which makes sense if we're changing how the paraffin colloids are actually interacting with each other. We also take a look at what the area is between these curves as well. In terms of chemical fingerprints in this case, right, there's really no change in the chemistry. So this is just a time trace of the gas chromatograph. So what comes off early is the lighter stuff, and what comes off late is heavier stuff. We can convert that into relative peak heights for different alkane chain lengths. And what you'll see really is the blue and the green pretty much match each other. So in this case, we're not changing the chemistry dramatically. In terms of water composition, what we're looking at here is trying to figure out also what kinds of ions, both cations and anions, that we're maintaining in solution. So a lot of wells have both paraffin problems as well as scale problems, right? We want to take a look at that. So what we're plotting here is the ratio of post concentration, or the concentration of the ions in the post installation sample versus the pre-installation sample. So if something's riding right at 1, nothing is changing, right? If it's over 1, so for instance, in this case, we're looking at bicarbonates, right? We've increased the amount of bicarbs that are staying in solution. Our alkalinity is increased, and then we also see a pretty dramatic increase in manganese, actually. All right, and so we're monitoring all these things because what's important about anions, both cations and anions, is the fact that it really changes your interfacial tension pretty dramatically depending on what you have in solution versus what you don't have in solution. So, for instance, in the situations where we're talking about emulsions and breaking those emulsions, we do think it has to do with things like the cation and anion concentrations that are present. So this is the summary that I promised. This is basically, green we're increasing, red we're decreasing, right? Blue we're showing no changes. And what you'll notice here is that basically we're kind of all over the map, right? And that has to do with the fact that every well is different, all right? Depending on where you're at and what particular zone, what types of gradients you have, the tool is going to have a slightly different effect. But in general, if we have a situation where, we're looking at significant paraffin increases, generally this is a well that's dominated by paraffin problems, whereas if we're looking at something down here like the Janey16H, really that well seems to be more influenced by dealing with the scale problems. So I just wanted to show you that we do take, we take into account a lot of what's going on. We haven't found the silver bullet in terms of the one measurement that will tell you if things are what the effectiveness or of the tool is, but we're working on that. So we're also looking at things like dynamic light scattering to look at particle-to-particle interactions. And with that, I just want to point out that really the goal of Relevant and the tools is to restore profitability to communities, rebuild communities, and basically renew hope with these types of technologies. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I appreciate the time that you've given us today. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Edwards. Question over here.
Harris with Chevron Energy Technology Company. Good presentation. You know, one of the things when you work for R&D, you get a lot of questions. So I've been hogging the mic these last day or so. My question, though, I got two. You ran for, Matthew, you ran for 3 months. Is there any indication what would happen if when you run your rods back in for another 3 months or 6 months? Can you speak as to cycling of the rods and the tool? And secondly, where's the best position to place this tool?
In terms of the cycling, can you be a little bit more specific on that? I guess?
Sure. Sure. You're showing your rod's coming up fairly clean. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming you're running right back in without having to do any steam cleaning to further treat your rods, and you're going back in.
That's correct.
Once you go back in, is there any more paraffin buildup on the paraffin that is still clinging to some of the rods to some degree? You've reduced it probably 90–95%, but does that remaining percentage act then as a catalyst to bring more paraffin to bond to the paraffin?
Yeah, I don't believe so, and the reason for that is we've recently pulled that Crystal 1, the more severe example that I showed, again for a suspected production drop, and upon the pull, the photos looked almost identical to what we saw. Very clean, no hints of solids or paraffin. We found chunks of what looked like packing in the pump. I don't know how that got there, but the paraffin issue was non-existent on that well. And so, you know, I think as time progresses, you know, we might pull 1 or 2 of these example wells, you know, a year or so after the fact, 2 years after the fact. We don't have a dedicated R&D team. I don't think we're to that kind of size, but you know, the fact that we're kind of having these runtime, ultimately we're going longer between well failures, and we think a big contributor to that is the mitigation of paraffin.
Okay, and the best position of the tool?
Yeah, so we yielded to Revelant on that, and they suggested kind of below, just above the pump intake, really. So for us, you know, we have our seat nipple kind of in our tubing, and then the tool, and then for the tubing example, and then you know, Mother Hubbard, poor boy gas separator, whatever kind of intake you have, and then we have our, you know, mud anchor joints below that. They also have like a gas anchor style tool that you can run. So, for instance, if you don't want to pull the tubing, you can pull the rod string and you know, either kind of run a gas anchor, or there's a kind of like a lift sub type tool that you can run right above the pump as well.
Any other questions? Question over here.
Bill Nielsen from Materion for Dr. Crummell. Why do you choose aluminum alloy for the tool?
That was basically historical purposes. And it's also easy to access from the foundry and pour the tool. It's not pure aluminum, and so there are other aspects in there that allow us to tune the last dynamics of the aluminum.
Thank you.
Yeah. One more question.
Yeah, Jerry Dietz with Encana. Matt, were these tubing deployed, or were these rod deployed tools that you used in your
All
test?
of these were tubing.
They were all tubing deployed? Yep. Okay, very good. Amber, one question I had on your last slide, I think it was up there. There was highlighted paraffin increases. What were you meaning by that? Was there?
So that was from the GC mass spec data, and so what it shows is actually an increase in basically C15 to C30 in solution post. So post installation, we're seeing more paraffins in the fluids that we're analyzing, which makes sense because it's not depositing on anything down the hole.
Okay, very good, thanks.
Uh-huh.
Good test. We were looking to test these as well, but it looks like you've done that for us, so we'll just go start using them.
Hey, one thing I'd like to add is all of these wells that we've installed the tool on, we've discontinued all paraffin chemical on. So we're only pumping corrosion chemical on these wells.
And just one more, Brendan Seeley in Canada. I guess, could you say the same thing for iron sulfide problems, right? You kind of keep that kind of stuff in solution where you don't see that. And then if you're not seeing it in the wellbore, are you seeing paraffin break out in your tanks, in your vessels and stuff like that? Or is it just staying in solution until it gets, I guess, or forever?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We've been doing actually a lot of shelf life types of experiments just to make sure that this fluid is stable, right? Because everybody wants to know, well, if I can get it out of the ground, am I going to be able to get it to the refinery, or is somebody going to yell at me in between? And what we found is that the fluids are actually very stable over the course of, now we're out to about 1 year and 15 months on some of them. So there's that. In terms of iron sulfides and iron sulfates, that's an area of active investigation. What we see in terms of our scale mitigation, in some cases, yes, scale is dominated by calcite, and so, but in other cases, it's actually dominated by things like calcium sulfate and calcium phosphates. Other times, there's iron in there, and so again, that's an area of active investigation for us.
Got another question over there?
Yes, you said your crystalline structure is growing, right? So you mentioned C15 to C30. As you, I'm assuming, continue looking at it in the lab, is there any certain limit that is going to start alarming you, like if it ever gets up to C80 or something like that?
So in terms of the concentrations that we see in alkane chain length, right, that just depends on what the oil is that's coming out of the ground. It's not growing as a function of sitting in the lab. So if it's C15, it means it's C15. That doesn't tell you what kind of colloidal particle that thing is forming with other resins, for example. That's what a dynamic light scattering measurement would tell you, is particle size, right? And so what you don't want is, you're right, you don't want to seed, a paraffin crystal and then grow it to being so large that that's a problem. And what we see is actually a pretty, basically small aggregates that's just staying in solution.
So, simply put, if it were to grow, or however you put it, to where you started seeing some C40s, C60s, do you think the tool will still be as useful as it is on the oil that you're using it on now, where it's like at C15 range?
Yeah, so really the question, I think that, or my interpretation of that question is, if you have oil that contains heavier constituents, right, is the tool going to be effective? And what we've seen is, yes, it still maintains its effectiveness out there. It changes slightly, again, depending on what the resins are that are involved there.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Any other questions? I have a question. Obviously, this is a very good topic because we deal with paraffin a lot. It's probably the #1 problem in rod pump application. So my question is, what's the well depth on these? Just kind of curious.
So vertical depths are 10,000 feet or so. The pumps usually sit above the perfs for us on vertical wells. 8,000 feet is where the sea nipple is typically, and then the TVDs on the Wolfcamp wells are deeper, so they're probably TVDs of 9,500 feet, 9,000 feet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what leads me to the first question: what's the optimum depth to put the tool? Most of the paraffin I've encountered was somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 feet. That's where they start occurring. Why not put the tool closer to that so you can get maximum effect going through the wellbore?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So the issue with, so if you see it depositing, right, that means you've already formed the seed nucleates that are then going to grow the paraffin crystals, right? And you want to drive those things from not forming. So you need to catch the potential crystallites when they're in this amorphous state. So if you're further down the well, then there's going to be a broader distribution of the seed nucleates, such that you're not going to be growing the ones that actually stick together and deposit. So that's the reason why you'd want to go lower if you can, and not just right at where the problem is.
So there's no degradation over the...
No, this also comes to kind of the shelf life type of question. Once you're producing that fluid and you've basically knocked your paraffin into a more optimal local minimum, it's going to maintain that physical characteristic actually through the entire process.
Would redundancy be useful?
What do you mean by that?
By adding two?
What?
Like having two of them? One at the very bottom and maybe one a little bit shallower?
That's a good
But
question.
does it even matter?
We haven't tried that.
You got one question.
Okay, final question. Sounds pretty good for moving our fluids up the wellbore. Now I'm concerned, what happens when I'm out of my wellbore and its fluids are heading to my facility? Is this related to the shelf life? And is it just long enough until I pass the chain of custody to where the problem now becomes someone else's problem, in which that can then come back and affect me in contract price negotiations?
Sure. So again, the longest shelf life experiments that we have running right now is 15 months. And we haven't seen any fluid stability problems in that time. But again, this is exactly why we're doing those experiments. And we haven't, basically, I don't think we're going to see a change. And the reason why is because what we've done is we've just simply changed, again, what local minimum that colloidal sample is in, or that colloid set is in, relative to the one that you would naturally find as it comes up the tubing. And so what that means is that to get out of that local minimum, you have to be able to drive it again, right? But we're not doing that. And so once it's there, it's stable.
Got one question over here, probably the last question. Oh, sorry. There's one right there next to you. All right, we'll allow two questions.
I just had a quick question. Is there any difference in efficiency between the tubing conveyed and the rod conveyed tool? And for Matthew, why did you guys go with the tubing over the rod?
We went with the tubing. So we had 2 horizontal wells and 5 vertical wells. How Revelant has it slated is that there's you basically, and I can tie this into running, in some instances they've run multiple tools kind of in series when there's more oil production, and so that's kind of what they've tied they've suggested that's more, if you have kind of a greater oil production count, then it might need a little bit more kind of application time, I guess, across the tool surface. And so just to kind of keep things consistent from work over field perspective, I had the guys run all tubing tools, just that they knew where to set it in every single well, so that there were no differences or just inconsistencies. So I think going by the oil production number, we probably could have gone with some of the rod versions of the tools in the lower vertical, lower producing wells, but just for consistency's sake for the field guys, I just had them run tubing tools in all of them.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hey Matt, I know we've had some surface issues with some of these higher producing paraffin wells. Now we're 6 to 8 months into this. Have we seen any improvement with respect to the back pressure valves, the chokes, the flow lines on the wells where we have the tools in them?
Those wells are all clean. We haven't had any issues with those moving forward, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, so we're not seeing any surface indication of paraffin buildup indicating that the molecules are staying in solution all the way to the tanks, all the way to the LAC, and then belongs to Plains or Enterprise after that, right?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? Good job, Matthew. Just tell your boss to remember that during bonus time.
I'm not going to tell them anything.
All right, so we'll move on to the next presentation. Next presenter is Levi Harris. Levi is joined Diamondback as a senior production engineer in February 2017 as